From the Times and the Sunday Times, this is The Story. I'm Manveen Rana. Just over a year ago, Rachel Reeves, the first female Chancellor of the Exchequer, was making history, unveiling her first budget amid triumphant cheers.
I have made an important choice today to keep every single commitment that we made on tax in our manifesto. Yeah. So I say to working people, I will not increase your national insurance, I will not increase your VAT, and I will not increase your income tax.
Well, that was then. Things were a bit quieter yesterday when Rachel Reeves took to the stage ahead of her next budget with a warning that we'd all have to do our bit.
As Chancellor, I have to face the world as it is, not the world that I want it to be.
She wouldn't talk about taxes, but the implication was clear. And Rachel Reeves isn't the only one desperately shifting into reverse gear on her economic promises.
We want to cut taxes, of course we do. But we understand substantial tax cuts, given the dire state of debt and our finances, are not realistic at this current moment in time.
So just how bad is the financial mood music? And is there a glimmer of hope on the horizon for any of us? The story today. It's the economy, stupid.
We knew something was in the offing really at the back end of last week. People started talking about a major intervention that Reeves was planning to make, but it wasn't really until yesterday that those plans got firmed up and we got told about a slightly unusual early morning press conference in Downing Street.
That's Oliver Wright, our man with his ear to the ground in Westminster.
We've seen them occasionally in the past. Keir Starmer's done them, but by holding them at that time, it is very much a signal that they want to communicate not just with us, but with the public. And that's when people are getting up, they're listening to the radio, they're watching television, and it's an ideal time to get their words out to the public without the sort of filter of Westminster journalists, because people are actually seeing it. Lots of news programmes will have cut to what Reeves was saying.
It does seem unusual. You know, previously, in the run-up to budgets, chancellors tend to keep their cards quite close to their chest. The little red boxes is where all the secrets lie. Why make this intervention now?
I think they'd thought quite hard about it. If you talk to people in both the Treasury and in Downing Street, they say they have to set, and I hate this phrase, but a narrative to this budget. They have to explain to people what they're doing before they actually get there on the day and announce what we all anticipate will be quite significant tax rises. They want to make the argument and try and win the argument now that the reason why they're potentially breaking their manifesto pledges isn't their fault, and to argue that several things are to blame. The war in Ukraine, the need to increase defence spending. Donald Trump's tariffs have played a part, that the economy is less certain, and that has weighed on growth. They also want to make an argument, which is really, really hard, that the budget watchdog, the Office of Budget Responsibility, they have been conducting a review of what's known as productivity rates in the UK, which is basically how much economic output there is per worker. And the OBR has been quite optimistic about that, really going back to the financial crisis. They continually think it's going to improve. And they've done this review recently, and they've basically said, we've got it wrong up until this point. Therefore, going forward, we're going to revise down our estimates for productivity in the economy, and that means we get less growth. If we get less growth, the government has less money in taxes. If the government has less money in taxes, they perhaps need to put up taxes.
There's another black hole.
Yeah, but it's a hard argument for the government to make because it's quite technical. And even if people like me in the sort of Westminster lobby have been following this stuff, it's a hard thing for us to get our heads around, let alone trying to communicate that to someone on a busy day who's only paying a little bit of attention.
And it's a difficult term too, productivity. I mean, she tried to explain it in the speech by saying it's not that you're not working as hard.
Yeah.
You're working harder but getting less for it.
It's not a question of how hard people work. Poor productivity means that we're putting in more, but getting out less. It means too many businesses and workers don't have the tools that they need.
And she wants to blame Brexit, she wants to blame Liz Truss, all the kind of usual suspects. But
Potholes and austerity.
Yeah, I think the problem is, if you cast your mind back to her last budget, she said, well, we've got this £22 billion black hole left by the Tories, we've got all these problems, I'm going to fix them.
This government was given a mandate to restore stability to our economy and to begin a decade of national renewal. To fix the foundations and deliver change.
This is a budget to, as she put it, fix the foundations. You know, I'm not going to be coming back for more tax rises. Now she's coming back for more tax rises and saying, well, actually, it's still the other lot's fault. And I think probably many voters' patience is wearing quite thin.
Ollie, if this was a speech for the public to prepare us for what's coming in the budget, did it work? I mean, what did we actually learn from it?
The elephant in the room was she didn't actually say, I'm going to put up people's taxes. She did everything but she didn't say it. And she was asked,
the word.
Are you actually saying you're going to put up people's taxes? And she didn't say it. That, to me, is sort of inexplicable. I mean, there will be a reason. They will have thought about it and they will have decided she was not going to say this. But why? You know, if I was sort of watching it at home in between trying to feed the children, I would have just been left totally perplexed by it.
And just remind us why it's such a totemic moment to have to admit that you're going to have to raise taxes. And this really goes back to their manifesto.
It does. At the last manifesto, Rachel Reeves and Sir Keir Starmer were very clear. We will not raise VAT, national insurance or income tax, the three big taxes.
We will not raise income tax. We will not raise national insurance. We will not raise VAT. That is a manifesto commitment.
And a manifesto, as everyone knows, is your programme for government. It lasts throughout the 5-year term of your government. That's what people who are trying to decide where to cast their vote, that's where they go. And, you know, there is an expectation that manifesto pledges are kept to, except in really special circumstances that the public can understand. So, in a way, the speech today was trying to make the argument, these are really special circumstances, you need to appreciate what we're doing, and that's why we're going to raise your taxes. It should be pointed out that if, and it's still an if, Rachel Reeves does decide to put up the basic rate of income tax by, say, 1 pence, that will be the first time in 50 years that any government has put up the basic rate of income tax. She is making a really, really serious political move here.
As you say, she didn't actually talk about taxes in that speech. So if it was about preparing us, it probably didn't do a very good job of it. The closest we got was a phrase where she said we must all do our bit. From that, it's really hard to tell, as you say, whether that means the basic rate, you know, the poorest in society, the people on the lowest income will also have to pay higher taxes, or if it's going to be sort of at the top end. Really hard to tell.
It is. I thought that was quite a significant phrase. You always have to remember that these speeches have been gone through with a fine-tooth comb and people largely don't say things they don't intend to. And, you know, I can see the reason why she might want to raise taxes for everyone. I mean, if you look at the numbers, if you put 1 pence on the basic rate of income tax, you raise £8 billion. If you put 1 pence on the higher rate of income tax, that's people earning over £50,000, you make £2 billion. So that's £6 billion difference. And if you are saying, well, your black hole, as it were, the difference between what the government, you know, expects to get in taxes and what they're spending is projected by the end of the decade to be £30 billion, you are obviously going to have to look at something that's going to raise you fairly large amounts of money. And so I think that is why she made that point. Now, that's not the same as saying there won't be other taxes that will disproportionately affect those that are better off. But I think she is suggesting that everyone will have to do a bit.
Everyone will have to suffer a bit. I mean, it was interesting because in the last few days, it feels like a lot of the argument has been around what qualifies as a working person, as if some people might be exempt because they come under a particular definition.
I mean, I think largely, under Labour's definition, a working person is someone who is a basic rate taxpayer. But, they've contradicted themselves because Starmer, when pushed, said, well, is a head teacher a working person and he earns more than £50,000? And he says, of course. So, I'm not really sure where it takes us. I think the sort of basic principle behind what the government is doing is that those people who have more money pay more and those people who have less money pay a bit. But there's another sort of wrinkle to all this. If you look at all the polling, everyone wants the government to basically go after what they would see as the super rich. But Reeves is well aware that this is a group of people who already pay pretty large amount of money in tax, but are also far more mobile than your average citizen.
Yeah.
They can go elsewhere. And the danger is that while some might decide to stay and pay the extra tax, others might just think, you know what, I've had it with the UK, I'm going off to Dubai. And if they do that, the government loses the entirety of the revenue that they were getting from that person. So there is a sort of balance there.
Ollie, you're having a lot of conversations all the time in Westminster, across Whitehall. What are you hearing about what she might actually do in the budget, apart from the potential income tax rise across the board?
There's a bunch of things that people are talking about, and actually it should be said that I don't think any decisions have been made. On this question of income tax, one of the more interesting suggestions that is doing the rounds is that Reeves might increase income tax by 2p in the pound and at the same time cut national insurance by 2p in the pound. Now, why is this significant? Income tax is paid by everyone who has an income. And if you get a pension, and say you get a pension worth £40,000, that is income. National insurance is only paid by people who are in a job. So what you would do if you raised income tax and cut national insurance would be you would effectively insulate people who are in a job from that extra rise in income tax, but anyone who wasn't would get hit. Now, it would particularly hit pensioners. Now, that's in itself quite a provocative thing to do, but it would raise the government £6 billion, which isn't far off the £8 billion that you would get if you just put 1p on the basic rate of income tax.
So that might be their way of making sure that working people, as they put it, don't feel the pinch as much.
Yeah, and secondarily,
but it hits pensioners.
We go to a really vexed issue, which is one of the triple lock, which is this idea that pensions rise by inflation, earnings, average earnings, or 2.5%, whichever is higher. And that, over the last nearly 15 years, has resulted in a very substantial rise in pensioner incomes. And if you look at an average of pensioners, they are better off than they were proportionately to some younger people. But the triple lock is such a toxic issue for a politician to say, actually, we're not going to do this any longer. Weirdly, if you did a sort of 2p on income tax, it's a stealth way of addressing some of the problems with the triple lock.
So you don't have to tear up the promise that people will get the higher pensions. You just find a way of taxing them more.
Yeah. So in terms of other stuff, I think there will be reforms to what's known as capital gains tax. So if you own a bunch of shares in a company and those shares go up by, say, 30%, you get taxed on the extra money that you've got. And at the moment, you get taxed at 20%. There are talks about changing that tax level to make it more equitable with income tax, which obviously, if you're a higher earner, is 40%. Then there's this sort of totemic question of whether you have a mansion tax and how you might do that.
So taxing wealth and not just income.
But that is fraught with difficulties. How do you work out what is a mansion? What rate do you have? The last time council tax valuations was done was 1991, so they're all out of date. But does any government, particularly a government on 17% in the polls, really want to do a massive revaluation of all properties just at this particular point in time? I think if you want a sort of rule of thumb from what we know and what she's said, they will avoid any taxes which they think are inflationary, because that's a big problem for the government. So you're not going to get a rise in VAT because that would put prices up in the shop. Instantly.
And what about welfare reform? You know, that's the other part of the equation. You can try and raise more money coming in, but what do you do about the money going out?
Yeah, the government, as everyone knows, was forced to climb down on this over the summer. Reeves was due to get £5 billion worth of savings for the changes. Those have now gone. My sense is that there is going to be nothing in the budget of significance on welfare reform. She's not going to try and find a way of clawing back that £5 billion, not least because she knows where her backbenchers are on this particular issue.
And Oliver, As you say, a lot of this was meant for the public. This is a warning of what's coming down the line. Quite often with speeches from the Chancellor, they're also meant for the gilt market, for the people who are buying the public debt, to reassure the market and to keep them happy. How happy do you think they'll be at the moment?
I don't know whether the gilt market has emotions, but in the sense that they do.
The brilliant Maureen Khan, last time she spoke to us about them, described them as gilet-wearing men called Hugh.
Well, I think any gilet-wearing men called Hugh will be delighted. What they were looking for was reassurance that Reeves was going to stick to her, as she would put it, ironclad fiscal rules to get debt falling in the medium term. Over the last 6 months or so, you have seen the cost of UK debt rise, and partly that's been a consequence of global factors. But over the last month, you've seen gilt yields fall really quite significant.
And just explain that, because that feels like a sign of confidence in the British economy.
And I think it is a sign of confidence. I think they are convinced from what they've heard and seen, and there will be kind of private conversations going on in the Treasury with some of these people, that Reeves will prioritise broader economic stability ahead of the sort of more popular answer of sort of keeping taxes where they are. And I think if you talk privately to people around Reeves, they're making a gamble. They know they're going to break the manifesto. They know that voters aren't going to like it. But if they can get the economy onto firmer foundations, they hope, come the time of the next election, there may be dividends. She may have money to either increase spending on public services or indeed maybe to have some sort of targeted tax cuts in other areas. So they're almost seeing it as a sort of reset moment. They are at 17% in the polls. I don't think, even if she breaks the manifesto, they can fall much further. I think they've fallen really to sort of absolute core Labour vote.
Yeah.
And they're sort of seeing this as, yes, it's really hard. Yes, they lose a lot of credibility. But if in the longer term that pays off in the economic sense, then maybe they can reap a dividend further down the line. But it's a big if.
It is a big if. But there are rewards to showing that you're sticking to your own rules. You talked about the gilt market. You can wipe off a £10 billion headroom if the gilt market doesn't like you, because they raise the cost of borrowing effectively. In the last month or so, we've seen them be quite on side, and that's actually given her an extra $5 billion.
It has, yeah.
Without doing anything.
Possibly even more. And I think the Treasury have been quite clever in the way in which they have released information. So at the start of last week, we heard that this productivity review from the Office of Budget Responsibility was really bad, worse than everyone had been expecting. Meant she had to find an extra £20 billion. Now, we don't know where it came from, but there are only two people that it could have come from. One is the Treasury and one is the OBR. The OBR do not have a track record of leaking these things. The Treasury does.
Interesting. They put it out themselves.
Why would the Treasury want to leak that particular figure when?
Why would they?
Because they didn't just have that figure. So at that point, they had all the OBR's projections, not just the productivity review, but also they're going to be looking at things like growth, where the last time they did this in March, they were very sort of pessimistic on UK growth. And actually, since then, the economy has grown faster than they would have thought. So you would expect they're going to upgrade their growth figures at this time round. Wages have also been growing faster than the OBR thought they were going to. So again, they'll probably upgrade wage growth. Now, if wages go up, the Treasury gets more money in taxes, therefore the size of the black hole shrinks. So my suspicion is that in the round, the OBR's forecasts were not as bad as perhaps the Treasury thought they were. So there's a sort of bit of expectation management going on here. They leaked the worst part of it and said everything is terrible without actually leaking the stuff which said, well, yeah, but on the other hand, it's not too bad over here. And interestingly, the Resolution Foundation, which is quite a respected think tank, they put out a piece of analysis today where they said they thought that the amount of money Reeves was actually, in the red could be as small as £5 billion. Now, she would still have to raise taxes by £15 billion if she wanted to restore the £10 billion worth of headroom. But, that's still a lot smaller than the 20, 30, 40 billion that have been sort of floating around over the last few weeks and months.
We just don't know how big that black hole is going to be.
No.
Ollie, you've been telling us about how Rachel Reeves is trying to prepare the ground for a U-turn on her electoral promises. She's not the only one. This week, we have seen Nigel Farage deliver a pretty extraordinary speech. There's a brilliant Tom Peck sketch of it in the Times.
There is. It's well worth reading.
And well worth reading. Under the headline, at times it felt like Nigel Farage was even boring himself.
Yeah, this was new, serious, Nigel. People may or may not remember, but Reform went into the last election with a bunch of policies which, I mean, no one really could see how they added up. They were talking about spending increases and tax cuts, and, I mean, it was Liz Truss writ large.
But I think the most innovative policy that we've put out in here is to raise the level at which people start paying tax to £20,000 a year. Why? Well, number one, it would take 7 million people out of the tax system altogether.
Cuts to personal tax, £70 billion a year. No one would pay any income tax if they earn less than £20,000 a year. Large cuts to stamp duty, large cuts to inheritance tax, cutting corporation tax. I mean, right across the board,
Wow.
They were cutting it.
Slash and burn.
Yeah, pretty much. But, they weren't getting that much scrutiny because nobody thought they were going to be the next government. But if you look at the polls, as a snapshot, they suggested there was an election today, Reform would be nudging getting a majority. So I think there was a sort of sense that they need to insulate themselves. They need to have policies that broadly added up if they were to be taken seriously. So what he was laying out was he was saying, yeah, I do want to cut taxes. I do have this aspiration, but we're not going to be irresponsible. We are going to cut spending to fund our tax cuts. And until we've cut the spending, until we've got the savings from those spending cuts, we're not going to cut taxes. So he's put the party onto a sort of, weirdly, a kind of more normal political party footing. What he is pledging really, frankly, ain't that different from what Kemi Badenoch and the Tories are proposing. Actually, arguably, Kemi Badenoch in her conference speech went a bit further than Nigel Farage with this promise to abolish stamp duty altogether.
Conference, the next Conservative government will abolish stamp duty on your home. I thought you'd like that one.
Even Farage isn't even promising that. But Reform has turned into a much more Thatcherite, right-of-centre political party after yesterday than it was the day before.
And now that they've adjusted their economic manifesto effectively, it is much tighter. There's no immediate promise of tax cuts coming. Do you think that's a result of, that realism comes from their experience of governing on the very small scale of councils? Because we've seen that hasn't quite gone to plan either.
No, possibly. I think the two things are not entirely related. But, you're absolutely right. In places like Kent, which they took control of at the last local elections, they are really struggling on some of the kind of efficiency pledges. This sort of plan to emulate Elon Musk's cut in the US, and it didn't go well in the US, and it didn't go well over here. You can make cuts to public sector spending, as actually the coalition government showed between 2010 and 2015. But it's complicated. You can't just do it overnight. Actually, it's a sort of 5-year process, and there is going to be pain to it. And you need to be upfront with people that this isn't entirely costless. And I think the fascinating thing is Farage is going into this next election potentially saying we're going to make very significant savings on welfare. But if you look at a graph showing where Reform does well and where the areas of the country that have the highest levels of welfare spending, the two are related. So is he really telling voters in Clapton, vote for me, I'm going to make you poorer because I'm going to cut your welfare payments?
Yeah. He said he's going to cut welfare, but has also promised to raise some benefits, like the 2-child cap. He would get rid of.
I think they're a bit hazy on that these days. They're sort of talking about 2-child cap for British workers, and that sort of was a slightly ugly concept. Really the 2-child stuff was a remnant of their previous sort of economic, not too pejorative, but incoherence. They would do whatever. They were trying to appeal to Labour voters, so they would say, we'll get rid of the 2-child cap. But that's 3.8 £2 billion, and even Labour is absolutely wedded to trying to do this. Reeves may not have the money to do that in the budget to the extent that she would like. And I think there's a political risk for it. I mean, I'm certainly tragically old enough to remember, the stories of families with 10 children claiming benefits. And if she puts up taxes for everyone at the same time as gets rid of the two-child cap, you're going to see those stories in the right-wing press emerging writ large. And I think that could be actually quite damaging for the government.
Ollie, tell us about the other parties. It does feel like there is a sense of economic realism across the board is starting to sort of dawn on people. For the Tories, they think they can find, rather than sort of being worried about a black hole, they're talking about filling it. They seem to think they can find another 47 billion behind the sofa. Tell us a bit about what they're promising.
I mean, again, they're looking at welfare, they're looking at civil service numbers, they're looking at sort of slightly nebulous efficiency gains. There's nothing magical here. There's not some idea that no one has thought of before. I think Kemi Badenoch is sincere in her belief that the state is too big. And, as I say, going back to the coalition government, if you look at the number of civil servants, the coalition government, for better or worse, did very significantly cut the size of Whitehall. And you were at a period of quite profound sort of technological change where in the past you needed one person or several people to do something, and you can probably automate quite a lot of that. But it's complex stuff. You don't want the public services to fall over while you're doing it, and it's not something that you can flick and switch and do overnight. But, she is essentially trying to position herself and her party as a party not necessarily of austerity, but of efficiency. And she wants to contrast that with Labour and saying basically Labour just wants to spend your money. They want to raise your taxes because they want to spend more, while at the same time saying, and by the way, you can't trust Farage.
There was a lot of talk before the last election that maybe politicians across the board just need to be a bit more honest. Everyone has a manifesto pledge that promises the world, and actually, maybe we just can't afford that. Do you think this is the moment where that's what we're sort of seeing? Politicians are having to fess up and admit that a lot of these things that they're promising just aren't economically possible.
I'm going to say something controversial. Don't we, as the public, need to fess up?
Yes. Yeah, but shouldn't there be a more honest conversation?
Aren't we getting the politicians we deserve? The basic point is that since the financial crisis, the UK has got poorer. We've got less money. During COVID, and actually during the energy crisis as a result of the war in Ukraine, political pressure on politicians meant that they spent a huge amount of money that we as a country didn't have.
Yeah.
And you've got to decide. There was a bill, I remember Rishi Sunak saying it at the time, and he was very worried about the furlough scheme. There was going to be a bill at the end of this. We're going to have to pay this back. I don't think politicians in any way can absolve themselves as responsibility for this, because I think that they've been part of this conspiracy not to say in terms that the UK is poorer, that you're not going to be able to afford the things that you want. It's not the way in which it was in the early 2000s when everything was great. They want to sort of still pretend that you can have jam today and jam tomorrow. But I think the public also need to realise that, because otherwise it's just a sort of recipe for everyone to be miserable.
It really is. Now, while I'm part of the public, and I understand we do need to accept that there's not necessarily going to be jam today and jam tomorrow, or jam ever at this rate. Is there some hope on the horizon? I mean, is there anything that we can sort of look to as something that it's not all bleak? It might get better.
I think you can look at some of the things that this government is doing, and actually things which any government that's in power was doing. They're putting a lot of effort into identifying and supporting the sort of technologies of the future to try and make sure that the UK is at the forefront of those. And if you look at things like medicines, bioscience, AI, quantum, compared to an awful lot of countries, we are not in a bad place. Our financial services are still, relatively speaking, strong compared to other countries. And if you have a period of relatively benign world events, then you could see actually the UK being quite a bit better off in 5-10 years than it is now. I think the risk and why everyone needs to be cautious is it doesn't feel like we're living in a benign world, and the UK economy is still much more fragile to any kind of shock than it has been, because we spent the money during COVID, we spent the money during the energy crisis as a result of the war of Ukraine and the financial crisis. So, yeah, if you want to be glass half full, you can hope that things actually were, maybe a bit calmer and things may be a bit better, but just have one eye on the rearview mirror.
That was Oliver Wright, policy editor of The Times. You can find all the latest on what to expect from the budget online at thetimes.com. The producers today were Shabnam Grewal and Alula Hart. The executive producer was Kate Lamble, and sound design and theme composition were by Mal Lassetto. If you can, do leave us a review wherever you get your podcasts. Thanks for listening. We'll be back tomorrow.